This is Chapter 10, covering Chapter 10, Photosynthesis, which is a great chapter in the book because it's nicely organized to where we can do this summary and have our enduring learning take-home messages and then get some details out of it. And where we're at is we've been talking about metabolism. And so we had Chapter 8, which was about introducing the energetics, which we're focusing on. And then Chapter 9, which is about cellular respiration, which is a primary function of the mitochondria. And then here we are in Chapter 10, Photosynthesis, and the focus on photosynthesis is entirely eukaryotes in this case. So we have prokaryotes, bacteria, and there are bacteria that are photosynthetic, famously, significantly photosynthetic bacteria. In the ocean, the bottom of the food chain is bacteria that can photosynthesize. They're called cyanobacteria. And they have pigments that can capture light energy and convert it into chemical potential energy. They're not addressed at all in Chapter 10. In Chapter 10, the photosynthesis story is exclusively eukaryotes, and so that includes the big plants and trees and so forth that we're most familiar with. And in eukaryotes, we know we've got a lot of internal organelles, and photosynthesis is a story about chloroplasts. It's significant to note that we have this endosymbiont theory that in ancient times a prokaryotic bacteria was at some point engulfed by a eukaryotic cell and led to the chloroplast. And we'll see that the chloroplast has a double membrane like that, suggestive of sort of like a phagocytic wrapping around another organism like that. And there's lots and lots of evidence for this to have occurred evolutionarily. So we're talking about something very different when we're talking about eukaryotic photosynthesis and chloroplasts. There are some ancient parallels. Just to note, mitochondria also were thought to be engulfed prokaryotes and we'll see some interesting parallels in cellular respiration and photosynthesis in the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And so the next thing to mention is that photosynthesis is this same reaction that's done in the mitochondria, right? So we just learned about this in Chapter 9. That's the overall reaction for cellular respiration. And this takes place in lots and lots of cells. In eukaryotes, bacteria have a different way of digesting, metabolizing, catabolizing sugars. That's what that is, glucose. And in eukaryotes, there are mitochondria in, I think, every cell. And it's this source of the cellular respiration, source of energy, source of what? Source of ATP production. So that's what's going on here. This reaction doesn't include ATP because this is the overall chemical reaction, like that takes place in a fire and releases this much energy. So every eukaryote. So it's important when we're talking about plants to appreciate that in the leaf of a plant, there'll be chloroplasts photosynthesizing, and in those same leaves there will be mitochondria. So it's interesting that the chloroplast job is going to produce sugars, and those sugars are also an energy intermediate akin to ATP. It's a way of storing chemical energy. So in both cases, we bump our chemical reaction up to higher potential energy. We have the reduced state of ATP, or we are going to take some carbon dioxide and bump it up to sugar. Those sugars can be used in the leaf. They can also be transported, say, to their roots that don't do photosynthesis. Roots are just like an animal. They have to get their energy source from sugar and through cellular respiration. During photosynthesis, it's interesting to see that photosynthesis is this reaction in reverse. The overall reaction of photosynthesis is that plants grab CO2 from the air, so atmospheric CO2 is grabbed, and there's an odd verb when the CO2 is grabbed. It's said to be fixed. And that means that the CO2 is taken from a gaseous state and incorporated into a carbon molecule of some kind. So we're going to have chemical reactions like that, and that's going to lead to sugars. Then what also is going on here is this, that plants also use a little bit of water and break the water and release famously oxygen. And famously because plants are responsible for the high level oxygen in our atmosphere that we're breathing. And it's interesting, we'll see that this is just sort of a byproduct of the reaction that's being produced, like that. But nevertheless, plants are doing the opposite reaction, and they're driving this uphill, highly endergonic reaction in that direction, that reverse direction. How endergonic? Check this out. It's that endergonic. So we just reverse this chemical reaction literally, and we need this much energy. Where do we get that energy? And the answer is light. So part of chapter 6 is, or chapter 10 rather, is introducing some aspects, some physical aspects of light energy, and then diving into the actual chemistry. And here's the chemistry. We zoom in on these eukaryotic cells, like the leaf of a tree, and zoom into the organelle, the chloroplast. You see the organelle has a double membrane, and in the inner membrane, in the inside of the inner membrane is where all the action takes place, and that region, or what people would generally call the lumen of the chloroplast, has a special name. It's called the stroma, and so we'll talk about the stroma because that's where things take place. And we're going to have some enzymes and sugars just floating in the stroma, catalyzing the chemical reactions to produce sugars. That's where the sugars are produced, and then they are transported out of the chloroplast. So the sugars are produced in the stroma. That's where the enzymes to synthesize the sugars are present. Then inside the stroma, there's another membrane-bound region, and it looks like stacks of pancakes, those green things, and those are called thylakoids. So we got a double membrane chloroplast, and then the stroma inside, it contains these enzymes, and then the thylakoid. And the thylakoid you'll see is green because the pigments that absorb light energy are in the thylakoid membrane. And the most famous of those pigments is chlorophyll. So we'll focus in on that. The book focuses in on that. And we're really walking through the book chapter because it's a pretty good chapter. Just to show you a couple of things in the anatomy of the leaf up here. So the leaf has outer cells. The leaf has, in these outer cells, there will be pores called stomata. And the CO2 from the air needs to diffuse into the leaf. It's still not inside a cell. It's coming through a hole that is lined by guard cells, and it's then in the liquid environment, diffusing into the liquid environment, and the extracellular space of the leaf eventually has to diffuse into the chloroplast. This is where the CO2 is fixed. And so we got to get CO2 to dissolve into the leaf, and then this is also the pore that O2 oxygen is produced and comes out of. And so that's what we're looking at, is we're looking at cells inside a leaf, and inside those cells the chloroplast, and inside the double membrane chloroplast the stroma that includes the sugar-making enzymes and the thylakoid containing chlorophyll. All right, so here we've zoomed in on this would be the inner membrane, or I guess it's probably showing both of the membranes. The inner membrane and the outer membrane of a eukaryotic chloroplast. And photosynthesis takes place in two parts. There are two stories, and the one story is called the light reactions. And here's a really nice summary of what happens during the light reactions. During the light reactions, the energy is absorbed, light energy is absorbed and is captured and not released. And it's captured, and that means there's a chemical reaction that is driven uphill, endergonic reaction, and that reaction, or that series, it's a series of reactions that lead to the synthesis of these energy intermediates, ATP, very familiar, and then instead of NADH, it's NADPH produced here. And again, these are both energy intermediates. There's a constant amount of ATP and ADP in the chloroplast and throughout the plant cell, and we're just recycling it. So see, we're producing it here, and we're producing chemical energy here, and then we're using that potential energy to drive this second part. It's called the Kelvin cycle, and this is where sugars are synthesized. So it's a series of chemical reactions. Each has an enzyme, and these the substrate and the product of all these reactions are floating in the stroma of the chloroplast. So we've got light reactions, we've got Kelvin cycle, and we're just going to talk through those in part. And the light reactions take place, this is the thylakoid. Light reactions take place in the membrane of the thylakoid. And so here we are zoomed in on the thylakoid. And so here's the phospholipid membrane of a thylakoid. And we'll see that in this inner space of the thylakoid, the lumen of the thylakoid, this becomes very acidic. There's a parallel the book talks about, and we'll talk about, with mitochondria. And we're going to be using an electron transport chain to pump ions across the membrane, and in producing a chemiosmotic gradient, that we're going to use that potential energy to synthesize ATP using ATP synthase. So we have this similarity with mitochondria. So this is why we have lots of membrane. The thylakoid membrane is sort of equivalent to the inner membrane of the mitochondria. That's where there's an electron transport chain in both cases, and it produces an acidic compartment, potential energy that's harvested by using ATP synthase in both cases. Okay, and we're going to stop this video here, and we'll start the next one with the light reactions.